Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy.
So here's another episode with Rick Eigenbrod and Judy Brown, two wise old sages of the industrial psychology, organizational development, and leadership world. And we keep having these topics that take us down all sorts of paths. And today's topic was founded on an episode from a few weeks ago that I talked about GSDs and the burnout. And Rick had a reaction to burnout. And so we said, let's have a conversation about that. And so amongst the elements that we talk about is how my inner hero needs a rest. So for those people that are ever the heroes, maybe you need a rest. The other aspect was being clear about what we mean, because burnout means it's done, it's an end. And so let's be clear and specific about what we're looking at. Is it an end? Is it a refueling? Where are we at? But anyway, enjoy the conversation. Cool. Well, welcome to this episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. And once again, I'm honored to be joined by two esteemed colleagues, Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod, who they joined me to talk about tough, deeper subjects. And a little while ago, I did an episode of the podcast on what I call get stuff done people, and how we're challenging the get stuff done people to, we've overburdened them in the last 3 years. And what we're seeing now is a lot of tiredness and burnout, and people are really, there's increased anxiety, and that burnout is having an impact on the work that they're doing. And we're actually seeing a reduction in the value of our get stuff done people because they've had 3 years of being dumped on a little bit. And I was framing that up when in a pre-conversation with Rick and Judy, and Judy, you were saying you're seeing some similar traits.
Yeah, the two areas that I see it most in, but what's interesting is it's not everybody. So one is in healthcare, and particularly people who are caring for elders, life care communities, hospice, a whole range of things like that. But even as I reflected on our conversation, because they're overloaded anyway. They've lost a lot of people during COVID, so they're understaffed. They've had a long haul of it. We didn't know how long this would last, and the answer is it's lasted longer than we expected. But what got me to thinking just now, David, with what you said is I could name some who would say they're burned out, but I can name some who, for reasons that are really interesting, are flourishing. And it makes me curious. I think it'll be interesting in this conversation to think about what that might be. The other arena that I think is really challenging is people who are teaching. I have a friend who has two nieces who teach in the public schools of Prince George's County in the lower grades. And they have classes of 25 or 30 where there are 25 or 30 different languages that are first languages. And so the amount of creativity and energy it takes just to stay connected to that many kids anyway, even if you all spoke the same language. And yet, while they complain mightily about it, they're not giving up. They seem to be hanging in there. It's sort of interesting. And yet I think we all have people around us in our lives who are just tired, is what I would say, of what they're doing, and will likely use the term burnout about it.
I was just going to put up on the screen for those that are watching, and for those that are listening, if you go to humanergy.com and check out the freebies page, you'll be able to see a model that we call the dangers of under and over capacity. And what this models is, if we're working at the right capacity, the peak performance, we're in good shape. But there's also an unsustainable zone where people get into exhaustion, fatigue, which is okay as long as there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But if they don't have that light, then they can move into what I call the failure zone, which is where you see this burnout, breakdown, anxiety, and anger in people. And I think to your point, Judy, that some people are really feeling tired and other people are keeping doing what they've kept on doing. But I wonder how close they are to flipping that switch and being angry at something because of this overburden that we seem to have put on people in the last 3 years. And as you describe it, we're doing it in the school systems by saying, here's 30 kids, all speak a different language. Some of them have mental health issues, and some of them don't eat before they come to school. Teach them something. And so the majority of our education system is crowd control rather than education. And that's why people are hitting this red zone in our little chart here.
I think that's right. But what interests me is, what is it about some people that they manage to stay in the green zone while the circumstances around them are what we would say are putting other people in the red zone? That's what's intriguing, and I have no idea. I mean, I'm just very curious about it. Rick, you want to wade in on this?
I was going to say that seems like a good segue, because when we were having our preamble about this, Rick came out with, there's no such thing as burnout. And so we said, that sounds like a good conversation to talk about. So having Judy and I established that a lot of people are struggling with burnout at the moment, let's go to Mr. Counter and see why there's no such thing as burnout.
Well, I don't have to go anywhere than being a keen observer of you two in action and listening. I guess if I could, in a sense, go back to you, because I've heard you say things like, they're tired of what they're doing. And you said that so quickly, as though those are the same things, or they don't matter. So I would ask you, and we're using burnout, early on you used they're burned out, they're tired. They're burned out, they're fatigued, as though they were the same thing. So let me put it back on you two for a second. I'm curious about when we use the term burnout, what do you think about? What do you observe in people that leads you to the quote unquote diagnosis that they are quote unquote burnt out? What do you see? What do you feel? What do you hear? What tells you they're burnt out? What leads you to use that word?
You know, when I think about it, I'm just kind of staring off into space. I think that it's that people who at one point seem to have a lot of energy and vitality for what they're doing just seem to have gone flat. I mean, that would be my language for it. And they may be able to point to reasons that that's so, but a lot of those reasons existed before they went flat. That they're not totally new circumstances. A pandemic is pretty new, but they were pretty overloaded before. They had all kinds of crises to deal with before. They had some nights without good sleep before, but somehow they're reacting to the circumstances differently now, almost as if they're a different person. So that's out of the gate what comes to mind for me. David, what would your take be?
Yeah, my immediate thought to Rick's question was, where's the term come from? And if you think about a fire, and the fire burns brightly and has energy and spark and heat and everything that comes off of it, and then it burns itself out because it's run out of fuel. And so somewhere around the line, it's run out of fuel. And that's where it goes back to where I was talking about my GSDs, the get stuff done people. When the pandemic hit, they were dumped on and they thrived on it because they were that kind of person. But then we haven't stopped adding to their plate in the last 3 years as we've pivoted and adjusted in every way we can. And many of them are starting to look like they're struggling with that weight. And how that can come across sometimes is that they're not reacting the way that they would traditionally have reacted. They can be a bit shorter with people. They can be sharp in their tone because they're not centered or calibrated in the way that they traditionally had been, which is another indicator in my mind, is that they're either tired, they're not completely healthy, they're not eating right, not sleeping right. somewhere along those lines, which is, how I would underpin that.
Yeah.
What
But
once was, so what, something happened. What once was fuel, the stuff to get done, ceases to be fuel for someone, although they're the same person and the fuel is the same stuff. I mean, Rick, wade in.
Well, I think we're really, I mean, if we're listening to ourselves a bit, what I think we're doing, or what I would advocate we do, is be careful about language and labels. As soon as we put a label on something, it becomes what it is. And a great line from but seeing is forgetting the name of the thing one sees. I think the minute we say burnout, it literally shapes what we see, how we respond, what we expect. In a sense, it's a diagnosis, and therefore it suggests a prescription. And in this conversation, I think we're beginning to be more discerning. So, for example, if I say you're burned out, that's like a diagnosis. And what's the prescription for that? If I say you're tired or bored or fatigued, overworked, I'm going to do something totally different than if I say you're burned out. Or if I say to myself, by the way, it's a new term, right? I mean, it's fairly new to the lexicon. So the notion that I'm also hearing is, burnout has something to do with energy and mattering, which is different from fatigue, which is different from being tired, which is different from being bored, which is different from being overworked. And that if I was to take my favorite position, which would be somewhat contrarian, I would say, I'm not sure there's a thing called burnout. I don't think people burn out in the sense that we use it. And we have to be really careful, because that term becomes a description of someone's character or their state. He or she is a burnout, right? And what are we really talking about? But we react to it in certain ways. So my premise would be, for the sake of conversation consideration, people don't burn out. They don't burn out. They can't burn out. What they burn out is the thing out there. And we have gravitated to using words like energy and mattering. And matter is energy, right? Matter is energy and light and vitality. So that I can burn out the thing I'm doing. I've just taken all the heat, light, energy out of it. It's got nothing to give me, right? So maybe we need to look at the thing out there, that it's not providing me with heat, light, vitality, and energy. It's burned out. For me, it's burnt itself out. The light is gone.
If I go back to David's analogy of the fire, when it burns out, all you have is ashes.
Exactly.
And you can't do anything with ashes. You can't reverse the process if what you have is a cold hearth and ashes. I don't know where to go with that, but
well, to think about it, Judy, if we say there's matter, that is, matter is, let's say it's things outside of us. Mm-hmm. It's the work we do, the relationships we're in, the activities, all that stuff. That can lose heat, light, energy, vitality for us, right? Then there's mattering. That's more inside. It's still about energy. Right. What matters to me, what I care about. I can stop caring about it, right? It doesn't matter anymore. And I don't have heat, light, and vitality and energy for that thing. My term for that internal state is done. You're just done. You got what you came for, or whatever used to matter doesn't. So I think this notion about burnout as some kind of pathology is a little bit tricky, and the need to be able to say to oneself or have a conversation that says, I just don't care about that anymore, is really different from I'm burned out.
Wow.
Or I used to care, now I don't. That thing used to give me light, vitality, and energy, and now it doesn't. And I mean, if you think about, if I think about, I put something in the oven and I bake it and bake it, right? At some point, it's done. And if I overbake it, it turns to ash. And I think that if we could not put that label very quickly, we could discern more, we could have more discernment about what's really going on with us. And the term I use with folks I work with is they're done. They're just done. It doesn't matter to them anymore. They got what they came for. The goal was achieved a long time ago. It just doesn't matter to them like it used to, and they're done.
So if I pick up on that though for a sec, Rick,
Go.
because what I understand you saying is that's if the oxygen's taken out of it, then they're done, if you like.
Yeah.
A lot of the symptoms I'm seeing is that people still fundamentally care. They absolutely care, but they're just they've got too much. They're out of the fuel. And I wonder, I don't want to stretch the analogy, but if you think about what fire requires, it's heat, fuel, and oxygen.
Right.
And so if we took that and said, well, if the oxygen is your internal, we're breathing that in, and the heat and the fuel are external, then what I think that what we're describing as burnout, and you're also, it could be in three different ways. That one of them is I'm just done with, I'm no longer energized by this.
Right.
I'm no longer breathing it, wherever it may be. It could be that the fuel is either gone or it's overwhelmed me.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it could be that the heat has been turned up dramatically, and it feels like I'm cooking through quicker than I should be, or the heat's gone, which means I'm having to work harder to get what I want from it. But I think the point you're raising is there's different dynamics to this, rather than just saying they're burnt out and they're a burnout.
Exactly, David. And I think we do ourselves and each other a disservice, because let's take somebody, I still care deeply, but I'm showing all the signs that we say, fatigue, lethargy, whatever. Then I'm saying, if I say she's burnt out or he's burnt out, what do we do with that? I mean, first off, it's kind of demeaning, but I'm not going to say, look, you really care a lot, but operationalizing that caring is harder and harder. For what reason? You're tired, you're exhausted, you're overworked, you're what, David, what you talked about earlier, the overdoers, right? Now I can go at this in a much more refined way than this global kind of you're burned out. But if I say to somebody, tell me where you are with this relationship, and they say to me something like, whatever, they're done. We know what it's like to be done with a relationship. We know what it's like to be done with a particular job, and we're done with that. We've all, I think each of us has been, Judy and I have talked with, we've been in these positions where we're just spinning our wheels. There's no energy in it for us, and no energy in us for it. We're done. It's a good place to be. It's developmentally saying, move on.
So if I pop up the little chart I had at the beginning, the dangers of under and over capacity there, what you're getting to is the center and the right-hand column, which, I know I'm using the term burnout in the symptoms of a failure line, but then what it talks about in terms of leadership action is give them some time off, make sure that they have the resources, realign them. And we struggled with putting it on here, but in the top right-hand corner, the individual action is look for another job. And it's got that little asterisk, which says, if all else has failed, that's what you're describing as I'm done. I've given my all here. It's now time to move on.
It is. It doesn't have anything to give me. And we know it's true. We've had this feeling in our lives of being done with a relationship. We've had this feeling of being done with a job, done with a position, done with certain kind of work. And it just means if I think about it, I have no energy for it, and it has no energy for me. That's a very interesting way to have to think about where I am in life versus I need a sabbatical, versus I need help, versus I need to delegate, versus I need to get rid of the should. Excuse me, the shoulds. I think one of the worst places we can be, David, and I think this is embedded in your chart there, is what I call to be done but not finished. It's really, my smart aleck one-liner is when people are done but not finished, they become a danger to themselves and others. Right? This notion about it's over, it's empty, there's no vitality there anymore. I got to go find vitality. That's really, wow, what a challenge for people. It's very just destabilizing and disconcerting. And the tendency is to hang on.
Yep.
Right. And we know, I mean, even if we look at the Hero with 1,000 Faces, it's, it's separation, initiation, and return. It's very hard to separate King Holdfast. King Holdfast becomes a curse on himself and the kingdom. And so I think we've all worked with people where they're done, they know they're done, we know they're done, everybody around them knows they're done, but for some reason they tell themselves they can't let go, they can't finish. And we know what it's like, the cost that they exact on themselves and everybody else.
So, I hear that I think it's a great way to look at that graduation. And we talked about this a number of episodes ago. Some things you just have to graduate, and you have to know that point when it's time to graduate and move on. It correlates to what you're talking about here. I believe there's a step between that, which is a lot of what I'm seeing, which is these people are by no means done. They still have an energy and a passion and a belief in the organization. The challenge is that they've been but a combination of overburdened and overtaken on too much in the last 3 years. And when it comes to, again, my chart says, well, you should resource it or refocus or reallocate, that people don't have the resources to be able to do that because we've been resource deficient for the last 3 years. And so there's no light at the end of the tunnel for these people who would really love to shed one of the 4 jobs that they've taken on during COVID, but there's nobody to shed it to. And so they're going further down this path to what you're talking about, which is there's going to come a point where they just say, I'm done with this. I'll go and be a greeter at Walmart because, that I just don't have to think too hard about that.
But the challenge is that they see themselves as people. They're the heroes. They're people who can do anything under any circumstances. So the meaning, the way they see their own value and the meaning they ascribe to things stands in the way of a conversation about what's really going on here and what might really be helpful, including admitting they're done, which might be one of the options. But if you're a real go-getter and suddenly you've got to sit down with yourself and the people around you and say, it's not, maybe I'm not such a great go-getter after all. That's a really shaking kind of self-admission.
Yeah, I was just thinking that it's the Peter principle for heroes, isn't it? I've taken on one mission too many, and now I'm no longer the hero because.
Right. Well, I'm starting a log of the things I say no to, for just that reason, because as somebody who has congenitally had a tendency to say yes to all kinds of things that were really interesting and that I love and that I care about, I simply have had to log the opposite in order to still understand that I'm still me.
Yeah, I was bursting to ask you a question that you had to say no to then, so you were forced to write it down, but I couldn't think of a good one. So I apologize for my humor getting in the way of that. It made me laugh.
I think that what we're talking about leads to what I say is it leads to discernment. We have it leads to a different conversation.
Yes.
It leads to non-judgmentalness, right? If I sit down and I talk with myself or I talk with you and I realize, wait a minute, I'm refining my sense about what's true for me now inside. I can say, you know, I'm not burned out, but the hero is burned out, is done. The hero is done. To stay in that heroic mode, I'm in a sense, a part of me doesn't have the energy, but I still have this imagery of being a hero. I become a danger to myself and others. Yeah. And so I think that I would just say that this conversation, I hope will invite people to sit down and take a step before we put language to something that constrains, that limits, and that leads to not really being able to get what one truly needs.
And what you're describing creates a gradation of it, if you like, because in some ways I'm done is the ultimate. It puts a label on, hey, I am done because there's no mutual energy in this anymore. If we step back from that, there's other places. And I like the route the conversation is taking down that. I just wrote down my inner hero needs a break. And I think it goes to what Judy's talking about, that if these people that get stuff done, people that I've described, are the heroes who have been relied on. And I think there's a tension between I've always been the go-to person and I'm failing.
Yep.
Which is a step before the I'm done. But it's that how does a go-to person ask for help?
That is a key question, because they've never done that before. It's not a practice that they have, and many of them can't spot the need to do it until they hit the wall, and the wall is I'm done, or some variant of it.
You know, David, we had a little side conversation about followership. And I you know, this term about what constitutes responsible followership. You know, in these situations, do we have a conversation about what constitutes responsible followership? And for me, one of the ways in which the hero can save themselves, or is, if they can't save themselves, is to be saved by people who are expressing responsible followership. That is, they come and they say, we need a conversation. And we need to talk to you about this. We want to give you this feedback. We want to offer you the other. Because the heroic personality will have a terrible time letting go of that.
Right.
And it's their developmental opportunity.
So that there's because I think that is covered on my little chart as well a little bit, and I've got a real scenario. I was working with one of these GSDs, the Get Stuff Done people, who was showing these symptoms, and one of the things that she was talking about was how she was working until 7, 8 o'clock at night, and you know, missing those things that were critical, and so I brought her back to a question the three of us will have asked people before, which is, what's important to you? And then she listed them all off, and of course family was first, and then I did the pulled the rug with the consultant's question of, let's have a look at your calendar and see whether that's reflected. And that was enough to get it. But the interesting thing is, she made a commitment on that day to leave work at 5:30 and not do it again. And what she's found in 3 months of doing that is that she's now more effective in the 8 hours she delivers than she was in the 15 she was trying to squeeze in, which I'm guessing comes back to she's delegated. She's said no to some things in order to fit that in, and is now doing quality work in the right space rather than trying to be the hero in every situation. and failing in some of them.
And what she's getting, back to Rick's question, she's getting what she needs. What she really needs is those other dimensions of her life that have been driven out by her get stuff done nature. And she needs them back in order to feel the vitality that's natural to her.
Which is interesting because it plays in. I think she made a comment about her husband had asked if she'd been fired because they're having dinner at 5:30. And it was one of those that it's changed the engagement there. It's changed the engagement with her daughter. It's changed the engagement elsewhere, which is that energy again. We're now picking up on the right fuel, the right oxygen to have the right balance of fire. And that, it took time and intention to get back to that. But that was what was key is her passion for the organization was still there. It was absolute. And part of that had driven the over hero-ness.
Right.
Yeah. Judy, this touches on some of the work you've been doing lately on narrative identity.
Yeah. I was just thinking of that.
This is a real challenge for these folks. Their sense of self is tied up in this behavior that we've described, over this, over that, over the other. And we're asking them, and they're inviting themselves to change that story, if you will. I'm not the person who anymore. I am the person who now. And so that sense of it, the overdoers, what's the story they are telling themselves about themselves and who they are? And what would it mean to them to change that sense of self, that story? And I'd rather have that conversation with them than have a conversation about, well, they tell me you're burnout. What are we going to do about that?
Right. Or me, or the person saying, I'm burned out. What are we going to do about that?
Exactly.
It brings me back to this simple, playful activity that I do in groups where I ask them to think about something that's frustrating to them. It might be the work situation, something else. And to be ready to tell 3 stories, and each of them a minute long. The first story is me as a hero in this story. I'm just doing fabulous things. I'm making a huge difference, blah, 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 blah. So they have to talk as a hero for a full moment, and then ding, that's the end of that time. Then they have to shift to, I'm a victim in this situation. Look what's happening. We've got the pandemic, yada, 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 for a full minute. And then ding, that's the end of that. And the third story is this as a learning journey. And they have to tell the story of this time as a learning journey. What's fun about it is if you get a whole bunch of people doing it at once, the voice tone is wildly different between the hero story and the victim story and the learner story. And once they can hear that difference in their head because they've heard it out loud, then I think they begin to be able to do what Rick's talking about, which is to refine the story and to understand. They really have the capacity to shift themselves between one of these stories to the other. A friend today told me about the same activity, but you put big sheets of butcher block paper on the floor, and one says hero, and one says victim, and one says learner. And the person starts the story on the hero, and somebody says, move to victim. And they have to move over to the other sheet of paper and shift into that story. And once they realize they can move between those narratives, then there's breathing space that they haven't allowed themselves before.
I wonder if I like that exercise, and I wonder if that applies. So if you look at my GSDs, the 3 years of pressure, and you're saying, hey, if they just took a moment today and thought about the last 3 years and wrote that story first as with them as a hero, then as them as the victim, and then them as the learner, maybe that would help create a little bit of that space that finds out whether they're done or whether they're just approaching this in a different way, and they need to approach it in a different way.
David, I never thought of doing it as a written exercise. That's a great idea, because I think they might see something on the page they haven't seen before.
Yeah, I challenge both of my listeners to have a go at that and see whether there's a few more than 2. But and I'd be interested to any comments that people have if they do that, especially the the get stuff done type folks in the last 3 years. If they just bracketed it since March 2020, I think that'd be an interesting introspection.
Yes.
Rick?
Dave, what strikes me in what you're saying is to get things done, folks. They see themselves as a hero. They see themselves as the savior, the protector, etc. But when we really, we know from my experience, when we look at what goes on in organizations with this kind of leader, they exact an enormous cost on the organization, right? In their insistence on being a hero, they exact an enormous cost, some of which is obvious, some of which is more subtle. For example, by them doing all of that and not passing on or the responsibility, et cetera, they are truncating the development of the people underneath them. And so, I think in a past conversation we had, then we put the notion out that the development of leaders as a human being is a business issue. And so in part, we could say to the hero, this change isn't, just for you. How you operate has business consequences. Because it's really hard to give up particularly something like the hero identity, the hero story.
There's another piece to this, which is they're colluding often with the organization in maintaining work processes and strategies that simply are not sustainable. And that's a very bad business practice.
That's exactly a great example of what I'm saying, Judy. We don't recognize that as much. That they exact a cost on the organization.
Yeah.
Which goes to the other side of it, which points to the organization then, from what you've said, Judy, and says to the organizational leader, take a look around and see what who are your get stuff done people you're colluding with to create these bottlenecks and these problems and this anxiety. Because it's, when it started in March 2020, absolutely, it was all hands to the pumps and everybody said, whatever we need to do, let's do, and we'll pivot and change and do everything else. The fact that that's continued is the biggest problem that I see, and that we haven't flipped back to where we were. And I think you're right, Rick, is that those heroes have enjoyed the thrill of that moment, and it's been piled on. But now it's got to a point where, as Judy puts it, they're in collusion in a death spiral.
Yes, that's a good way
until somebody breaks that.
Right.
And the energy they used to get from being heroic, that hero's role, they've burnt it out. It's ashes. It doesn't have anything more to offer them, right? And they may still care, but that structure, that form of expression, that work provides nothing, provides no energy for them.
And so the closing picture I have is Superman, Batman, and Spider-Man all in the retirement home. Because they no longer have the energy for what they did before. But and I don't know if you've read the book, the Thursday Murder Club by a guy called Richard Osman in the UK, but he kind of applies these old people's home where they all become detectives and solve crimes. And so there's a retired Superman, retired Batman, retired Spider-Man who still have some passion and energy for this, but they just don't want to be swinging around the city. And we've got the same with our heroes in the workplace. So that's another 40-minute conversation that has passed very quickly for us in the Zoom room here. I hope it's passed quickly for the folks listening as well. And I'd be interested in, please don't hesitate to let me know if you do that exercise that Judy recommended and you find some value. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and you can contact me through the podcast. In the meantime, Rick, Judy, thanks very much for another stimulating conversation, and we look forward to having you back soon.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
So that was Rick Eigenbrod and Judy Brown and myself having another 35-minute-ish conversation around a useful leadership topic, I hope. If you didn't quite pick it up, if you go to humanergy.com, there's a page called Freebies in the resource section, and you'll find the dangers of over and under capacity chart that I'm talking about in that section. You'll see some other tools in there as well. And if you do the exercise that Judy was suggesting, around the thinking about the last 3 years from the perspective of seeing you as the hero, seeing you as the victim, and seeing you as the learner, then I'd love to hear about what insights you glean from that. So send me a note. Thank you very much.
That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.